Hi friends, hope you're doing well. This video is going to be about the events that are taking place, the peace accords and so forth, but my focus is going to be on the rebuilding of the Jewish temple. Why is that important? Well, with the events that are taking place, I don't generally like to do videos and just, be reactionary. I like to wait and see how things land, how things fall out a little bit. Give it a little time. Let's see if it's going to if it actually means something, if it's a big nothing burger or is it actually got some meat on there. Well, this one looks like it's got meat, so that's important. So we do see events that are taking place. We see a lot of nations signing on to this 20-point plan of Trump. I find that very fascinating. What I find more fascinating is he came out shortly thereafter and said he thinks a lot of these nations who signed on to this 20-point plan, which are primarily Arab and Muslim nations, are going to sign on to the Abraham Peace Accords. Well, that tells you that the Abraham Peace Accords are still going on. The talk is still happening. The behind-the-scenes conversations are happening. And it's the Abraham Peace Accords that I think that might wind up being that 7-year peace accord that the Bible talks about, that all Christians have been looking for, especially students of the Bible, especially when it comes to prophetic literature that we study. If you've never studied it and look at it, okay, well, how does this all play out? Why is it so significant? What's the deal with the temple, and why? Who cares about that part of it, and so forth? It's actually very significant and it's very important. It's an essential part, actually. And the fact that there's been a lot of whispering that's been going on by notable people who are in the various administrations, talking and mentioning the temple and the Temple Mount. Well, that tells you it's on their mind. It's on the docket. It's where this didn't come out of nowhere. It's definitely in their thinking. It's on the plate, as it were. And the fact that these voices have been, that are in powerful positions of the administrations that are involved in this peace agreements, have mentioned the temple itself specifically, and the reestablishment of the temple, Jewish temple, the third Jewish temple, as it were, rebuilt on the Temple Mount. That's very important. And the fact that it's even being talked about, that caught my attention. And then when Trump obviously said that, a lot of these nations are going to sign on to this Abraham Peace Accords, that caught my attention even more so too as well. And that's because, the 20-point plan is basically a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, so-called Palestinians. So, that's what this is about, rectifying that war peace accord and establishing, in essence, the dividing of the land. How this is going to ultimately play out, which kind of falls in line with what I've done videos on before, but it's very important. It's an obscure, smaller book, Minor Prophet Joel, chapter 3. And I've gone into that verses 1 and 2, where it talks about the dividing of land and Jews being brought back to their land and so forth. That is the point in which we get the result or the consequences that will lead to Armageddon. A lot of people miss that because it's such a small book, but it's actually very significant. It is saying that that's going to be what will happen, a dividing of the land. Well, just so happens this peace accord is all about dividing of the land, and it talks specifically about Judea and Jerusalem. Well, it is very fascinating that Judea and Samaria is the real stickler that most people are concerned about. If you listen to what Jews are saying and you listen to what various people who are in the administration of the Knesset and so forth, it's about, hey, this is the real West Bank. I mean, we got problems down here in Gaza that we can figure out, but the West Bank is a much bigger issue, and we need to figure this out, and that's going to be the real stickler on any peace accords. And that's what this whole Abraham Peace Accords is ultimately going to be dealing with, which is the dividing of the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria. The Bible, in essence, says that Judea will become a part of Israel, and that it's going to be a dividing, which tells me that probably Samaria, part of it, will be divided and given over to the so-called Palestinians. And it's the taking and dividing the land that ultimately leads to Armageddon and these nations that will sign on to it. That tells us we're very close. And when you get into Ezekiel prophecy 36, 37, it's talking about the Jews who are brought back to this land, reestablished on the mountains of Israel. 38, 39 of Ezekiel talks about the great war that's taking place, the Gog-Magog war, spoken of also known as the Ezekiel War. That's been talked about as well. That alliance of nations is operating right now. So we have the alliance of nations for Ezekiel 38, 39, the Gog-Magog war that he talks about. They're in existence right now, and they are working together. That's primarily Turkey, Russia, and Iran. Those are the nations primarily, and they use their original names, parent names, as it were. So what's very fascinating, if you see that going on, you see these national alignments that seems to fit. You see this return of the Jewish people, that fits. You see that there's this peace accord that's talking about. Well, what does this got to do with the temple? Well, that's what we're going to deal with. So there's primarily just 5 major verses, but they're all in the prophetic elements of the return of Jesus Christ. So let me just first sink the ship that seems to never sink, that people bring out. So a lot of times people say, oh, they've been talking about prophecy and return of Jesus Christ forever, and da-da-da-da-da-da. And, it's just apocalyptic language. It's not real. You don't need to take it literal. These are the same people that typically will say, everywhere else in Scripture, you need to take it literal. Where it talks about salvation and Christology and so forth. You need to take all that literal. But somehow when it comes to prophetic literature, you don't take that literal. It's just apocalyptic language from the book of Revelation. It's just metaphorical. It's just allegorical. And it's just telling you how you can live a better life, and how it's telling you stories, and how you're to, ultimately live your Christian life. And, it's just giving you this wonderful story. It's like, no. Anybody reads through that, you can just see right through it and say, that makes absolutely no sense. And if you look at the rest of Scripture, it's all literal. Jesus Christ really was born of a virgin. He really was betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. He rode in on a donkey. He surely was pierced through his hands and feet. Again, he was born of a virgin. He truly was the Son of God, called the Prince of Peace. He truly was a light to the Gentile nation. I mean, you go down a list of all this. It's all literal. It's all literally fulfilled, not symbolic, figurative, allegorical, apocalyptic stuff, and somehow you get to Revelation, they're telling you, oh, just ignore it. No, it's actually telling you what's actually going to take place. And it does use symbolic language, and it does use some metaphorical speech sometimes. But in general, it's all literal. And he's even telling you, explaining to you, well, it looked like this, it appeared like that. But in general, he's telling you, this is what's going to happen. And for some reason, people have bought into that. And it's kind of always confused me for some reason why people so easily accept that, because it's a very poor argument or, way to not examine, look at it, or try to, and I think it comes down to the fact that some people are intimidated by prophecy and they don't want to teach on it. And so therefore they say, well, it's just allegorical. I can just kind of work my way through it, figuratively, and then how it's, kind of played out in your Christian journey and walk. And then we can move on back to the things I feel comfortable teaching on. And I don't think they mean to do it as in a deceptive way, but that's certainly, unfortunately, it makes for Christians who are ill prepared for the events that are taking place, in my opinion. No, we need to actually be studied and listening to it and believing what it's saying. God said this and gave it to us for a reason, not so he could tell us a nice allegorical story so that we can try to figure out how we're to somehow live a better life through this metaphorical, allegorical type language that people like to throw out there as apocalyptic language. That just makes absolutely no sense at all, and it doesn't give God credit. No, clearly throughout prophetic literature, in all of it, it's very literal. When you read through Isaiah, it's very literal. When you read through Daniel, very literal. Those events really did happen and are happening. And you go through Zechariah and others, very literal. You get into the New Testament, it doesn't magically change to become allegorical because you don't want to teach on it. No, it's actually very literal. And that's what's going to take us to this. And there's been a lot of talk. A lot of people are alluding to the fact that with this Abraham Peace Accords, that is kind of a following, it's out there, still operates, that's very significant. And when you see people talking about the red heifers and the Levitical priesthood that are trained, literally being trained in Israel and are, in real life operating, when you see them doing the sacrifices and you see them doing, making up the artifacts and so forth, that's all really happening. That's not figurative or allegorical or anything else. It's really happening. These people are preparing for the rebuilding of the temple. And when you see people in positions of power and influence in the various administrations around the world that are talking about and mentioning the rebuilding of the temple, and there's been a lot of that recently, and that's what kind of captured my attention, besides the talk of the Abraham Peace Accords. That tells you that the Antichrist is probably alive and well, and he's probably operating, he's probably involved in this whole peace accords, if it ultimately is the 7-year peace accord talked about. And that's what we're going to come to. So first I start off in, I'm just going to go to 5 verses and points, but they're significant, and that's where it talks about the temple and why it's important. And it's something that we can be looking for. So Matthew 24, verse 15. So Matthew 24, 15 says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Okay, then it goes on to talk about those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Okay, so clearly Judea is part of this whole thing as well, but that goes back to Joel, like 3, what I started talking about. But importantly, what it says is that when you see this abomination standing in of desolation, standing in the holy place. So it's the holy place of the temple. It's going to be rebuilt during this period of time. This is all in times. It's not 70 AD stuff. It's not 130 AD, 132 to 135 AD. It's clearly talking about in end times. How do you know that? Because if you read through it just a little further, it goes on to talk about that this is, like verse 29 says, but immediately after the tribulation in those days, the sun will be dark. It's talking about this final period that has never been like it before and never will be again. So it's clearly saying that this is the end times events that's being talked about. It's not 70 AD. You have Emperor Vespasian and Titus 10th Legion went in and destroyed it and took a lot of Jews off to captivity. And that's where you had the Wandering Jew, and that's where you have this whole Ashkenazi Jew thing. It's like they were in Europe. Well, that was because they were taken off to captivity throughout the Roman Empire. And they were scattered, and approximately over 1 million, they say, Jews were killed during that period of time by, obviously, the 10th Legion. It was very brutal, very violent, but the temple was destroyed. Going back to like Daniel talks about with this Messiah during the 70-week prophecy that was given to Daniel by God through the angel Gabriel, came down, gave him this amazing prophecy that says, hey, this is what's been decreed for you and your people. This is it from now until the end. I'm giving it to you right now. This is what's going to happen. War's been decreed until the end, so obviously that's why we have continual wars all the time. That's literally fulfilled. And it goes on to say that there's going to be this one who's going to come, this Antichrist figure. But he's saying that there's going to be an abomination that takes place. And he says, spoken through Daniel the prophet. Well, that's what he's talking about, which is in Daniel 9:27. So the 70-week prophecy is verses 24 through 27. And in it, he's saying, hey, this is what's decreed on your people. And he's going on to say that this Messiah is going to come. He's going to be killed. He's going to be cut off. But, and the temple is going to be destroyed. So we know that, the temple and the sanctuary is destroyed in verse 26. The Messiah is cut off in that same verse before it says the destruction of the temple. So you have the second temple being destroyed and the Messiah before dying. So Jesus came literally and died, was cut off, and the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. So you have 32, 33 AD, Christ dying, 70 AD, the temple being destroyed. It perfectly fits literally what Daniel says. It's very accurate. And then it goes into the fact that this one who's to come, of the people who destroyed the temple, which was the Romans, for sure. So it's the revived Roman Empire. That goes back to the idea of the 4 final empires that are talked about specifically. I won't get into that in detail here for time, but when it's talking about these final ones, the 4th one that is revived with the 10 toes corresponds with the 10 nation alliance that we're going to see with the Antichrist will reign over, talked about in Revelation chapter 17, last half of that, and also in parts of Daniel it talks about it as well, this final beast empire. Well, this Antichrist figure is going to rule over it. Interesting enough, right? That's what's kind of missing still. We don't have this 10-nation coalition. There's certainly peace accords being talked about, and there's talk of a temple now happening, people mentioning it in the news. I found that very fascinating. And the fact that we do have, in fact, have people in Israel who have all artifacts redone, training the priesthood, really are prepared to reestablish the temple. Well, here, lo and behold, the Bible's literally saying it's going to happen. So we need, as Christians, be prepared for that. And some people will say, wait a minute, time out. You can't have, the Antichrist can't come on the scene first. And because, what happened to the pre-tribulation rapture? Or okay, is it post-trib? It's like, no, pre-tribulation rapture, I'm certain that pre-tribulation rapture is. But some people believe that, and I think this is the best one, and I won't go into detail here because I've done it in other videos, but I'll give you a little bit. You think that many people think, unfortunately, when they think about pre-tribulation rapture, that somehow you're raptured, and then comes the revealing of the Antichrist, and then comes all these events immediately, like bam. It's like he comes on the scene, we're in the tribulation. It's like, well, no, that's not how. If you read through it, that doesn't make any sense. Right here in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, right? He's affirming the covenant for the final week, the 7 week. That's where we get that 7 years of tribulation. And then we find out later that it's 3.5 years that he's basically It's war, in essence. So a lot of people think, oh, he's just coming on the scene, bam, we're immediately into the tribulation, so he comes on the scene and affirms the covenant. That's not how it is. And if you get into 2 Thessalonians, which we're going to come to here shortly, he has to be on the scene. He has to be in power to affirm it first, which tells you that there's already peace agreements being talked about. He's already in a power to be able to confirm this covenant. So he's already on the scene. And that's why Christians are going to be saying, this is the guy. This is him. When they start saying that there's a peace agreement for 7 years, many Christians are going to be saying, this is the Antichrist. And when they start talking about rebuilding of the temple, which is now being talked about, and they've got this peace agreement that's happening between Israel and the nations. It's not between, Hamas and Israel, which is what the 20-point plan is. But it's that Abraham peace accords that I find more important. Is there a 7-year element to it, or will there be a 7-year element to it between Israel and the nations? And it'll be between Israel and the other nations. That's going to be important. And part of that will be a dividing of the land, like Joel chapter 3 talks about. I think that's very near. And part of that will also be the rebuilding of the temple. Make no mistake about it. The temple is a significant point, as we're finding out right now. And you're seeing the temple is going to be very significant because the Antichrist is going to have to go into the temple and set up this abomination that causes desolation. It's the establishment of this abomination that causes desolation. That's why some people say, oh, well, you can't, it's going to be the temple of the Antichrist. You can't support that if you're a Christian. That's not true at all. The fact that he goes in and establishes it, goes into this holy place. It's calling it the holy place. It is holy. They're commanded to rebuild a temple. And yet they're doing what they're commanded to do. But it's when he sets up this abomination that causes desolation. It's abomination because he puts something unholy in a holy place. And then it becomes what's desolate because it ultimately leads to the desolation of the world and the destruction of Jerusalem and all those other places that are involved in the death of 2/3 of all mankind, if you read through Revelation. That's why it's so significant for us to share the gospel with the lost, because everybody that if they're not a Christian, they go into the tribulation, 2/3 of all mankind will be dead. So think about it. 2/3 of everybody will be dead within 7 years. That's what makes this so important. That's what makes prophecy so important. And that's why our calling as ambassadors for Christ is so important. And share the gospel with the lost. It's so important. It's not just trivial, oh, wow, that's trivia stuff. It's nice. Okay, thank you very much. Let's get on to other things. No, it's a subject of life and death. It's something that we as ambassadors who take this calling serious to share the gospel with the lost because we love them, care about them, and we don't want them to die in some terrible catastrophic events that's going to take place. It could happen very soon, especially with the events that are taking place right now. If this Abraham Peace Accords is ultimately the Peace Accords talked about, and the alluding to and talking about the rebuilding the temple, which all that's true, all that is happening right now. The only thing is they just haven't mentioned the 7 years yet. But if they do, we know that those people who are affirming it, one of them is the Antichrist. And that means he is on the scene affirming it. And it's at that point. I honestly believe that once the rapture takes place, Antichrist affirms it, the 7 years are talked about, we start pointing that out to everybody we can. Rapture then takes place because of, we'll get into here in 2 Thessalonians why. Then you have the apostasy that takes place. So I think we're seeing the great apostasy right now. I think if you look around, you got splitting the churches because of the LGBTQ thing. You got people who don't even believe in Jesus Christ, supposedly Christians in the church. It's the great apostasy is definitely happening, in my opinion. It's definitely there. It will be on a greater effect when they start looking to the Antichrist. But also, when you look at the events that are happening where it talks about this, rebuilding the temple and other things that will happen, I think it's shouting at us that we're going to see that this is the Antichrist, and that's what it says. We will see the great apostasy, and then we will see the revealing of the Antichrist. Well, the revealing of the Antichrist doesn't mean he comes on the scene and bam, here we're in a tribulation, as some people believe. It just means that we're going to be able to know who he is because of the 7-year peace accord that claim to rebuild the temple, these kind of things. We're going to be like, dude, this is the guy. This is the Antichrist. And we're going to be trying to tell everybody. And that's the revealing of the Antichrist, really. Because we're going to be saying, this is the guy. And it's going to be waking people up. And they're going to be like, well, is this really right? And then, bam, the church is out. The pre-tribulation rapture takes place. It's the only one that harmonizes the rest of Scripture when you stop and look at it. I won't go into it now, but if you look at it, Pre-tribulation rapture is the only one that makes sense. It's the only one that fits. Many Christians will come to faith in Christ during the tribulation period, and they will die for it. Those are the ones who are in the part of the first resurrection. That's the only ones in the first resurrection. But the church is already in heaven in chapter 19. How'd they get there? I mean, if they went into the tribulation, they would be in the first resurrection. But the church is already in heaven in chapter 19. First resurrection, chapter 20. Unless the church, you're saying from the apostles to the tribulation, are in the second resurrection, which means they would miss the reign of Christ, the Sabbath day rest, our reign with him, and then we would be judged at the great white throne judgment, where they're judged according to their deeds. We'll be judged by our deeds, not by our faith in Christ. None of that fits, which tells you that the church is already in heaven with Christ as his bride at the wedding banquet, which is taking place in Revelation 19, verse 7 through 14. So how did they get there? You have to be there before the tribulation. That's the only thing that fits. And then you have the first resurrection of those who have died as the tribulation saints, which are talked about in chapter 7 of Revelation, verse 14 and on, I think 14 through 21, I think it is, who have gone through and made themselves pure with the blood of the Lamb and have been martyred for their faith. And those are the ones who are resurrected in the first resurrection. Clearly two distinct people, both being resurrected in heaven for various reasons. You have to explain that. If you don't believe in a pre-tribulation rapture, you have a very difficult time. How do you reconcile that? I think Christians are going to say, this is the Antichrist. He's been revealed. The apostasy's taking place all around us. And then, bam, we're out. And I think it's that moment, with the mass removal of millions of people around this planet, that you're going to have a catastrophic collapse of the economic world system. But will be ushered in at that moment because of the fear brought in that the Antichrist will be able to usher in, and you're going to see this rise of this 10-nation coalition. Out of that, you're going to have him bring in this. He's going to have all the answer solution, his beast economic system, a marking system that every nation will have to sign up. And because of the massive amount of fear that's happening all around the planet, and turmoil and apprehension and everything else that's happening because of the instability, they're going to sign on to it. And they're going to be listening to this guy. He's got the answers. He's got the solution. And then people are going to sign on to this 10-nation coalition very quickly. And he's going to be moving very fast, very quickly. And part of that will be the Abraham Peace Accords, or a peace accord similar, that will have them sign on to it. Temples being rebuilt. He ultimately will go and declare himself to be God 3.5 years into it. Make sense? All right. So that's where we're at. And that's how I see events moving. And it could be happening very quickly, brothers and sisters. So you need to be looking, be ready, and we need to be serious about our ambassadorship, our calling to be Christ's ambassador, going out preaching the gospel, preaching reconciliation between God and man through faith in Jesus Christ. That's our calling. That's your calling. That's what we should be doing. Take it very serious. But what he says here, he says, and he will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, or 3.5 years in, he will put a stop to sacrifice, grain offering, and on the wing of abomination will come to make one who is desolate, even until the complete desolation, one that is decreed, is poured out upon the one who makes this. He's going to be thrown into a lake of fire. So he's going to be him and ultimately his companion, which we find out later in Revelation 13, this second beast, which is the false prophet. Anyway, that brings us to Revelation 13. So Revelation 13, verse 15, it says, and it was given to him to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast would even speak and cause as many who do not worship the image of the beast to be killed. So it's going to be interactive. And that's where I think this whole AI thing, and isn't it interesting that Trump and these other people are pouring $500 billion into the whole ideal of the AI thing. And I think the AI will play a significant role in this, maybe connected to people's phones, internet, and all this other stuff that's going on, that somehow this AI generated figure of the beast that will be worshipped all around the world, but it will be centered in on the temple. And notice right here it says that, and it was given to him to give life to this beast. In essence, interactive somehow. It's going to have this artificial intelligence, as it were, that will be so powerful and inundating the entire world that the world will wind up worshiping this Antichrist being who goes in the temple and declares himself to God. I think this fits perfectly with Matthew 24:15 I just talked about. Here we have Revelation 13 verse 15. It also corresponds as a referencing Daniel 9. I think that interlocks all of those into that this is the same event. That all three of these things, all three of these different writers and prophecies are all talking about the same thing, same event. And somehow interactive idol, as it was, that is plugged in somehow, that has this immense ability to know who's worshiping and who's not, and who's got their allegiance to the Antichrist figure. And this is that abomination that causes desolation. So he sets that up on the wing of the temple somehow, and all the world will worship it, and that will cause the abomination, that will cause the beginning of the middle of the tribulation, because it says in the middle is when he goes in, right? We just read that. So in the middle, so the midst of it, he sets up this idol, and that's when war takes place. You got the four horsemen apocalypse talked about in Revelation, where it talks about these four horsemen, that which is an overview of the whole tribulation period of time. That's all it is. So people get that mixed up, but the four horsemen are just the overview of the totality of the of the tribulation period of time. So you have the white horse, false peace that will take place. Red horse, war, global war will take place. Black horse is economic famine and mass death. And then you have obviously the pale horse, which ultimately will be this disease and followed on that will cause death, and ultimately hell falls behind it. It says because those who died at that period of time will go to hell. So yeah, that's what it's talking about. So it's an overview of this time, which Jesus referred to as the time of testing. And notice, and it does say that we won't be here. We'll be saved from this time of testing. So that's important to remember why, again, I think it alludes to pre-tribulation rapture. But anyway, here we go. It talks again about this beast and this worship of him and so forth, and this image. And I think that locks together those verses. That brings us to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses, we'll do 3 and 4. It says, let no one in any way deceive you, for it will not come unless, and it's talking about what will not come. Well, you have to read the next previous verses. Us going to be with the Lord. So don't let anyone be shaken, blah, 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 that somehow you've missed this period of time to be with the Lord because you're suffering persecution. It's like, that's, that wouldn't make any sense otherwise if it's not a pre-tribulation rapture. If you're suffering persecution and that is part of going into the tribulation period of time, then they would be like, dude, we're in the tribulation. I'm not concerned at all about missing the time with the Lord. It wouldn't make no sense, right? But if somebody wrote to you and said, hey, you missed the rapture of the church, you missed being with the Lord, and that's why you're now suffering through this tribulation period, that's, now you can see why they were upset. Wait a minute, did we miss the Lord's calling for the church? And he's like, no, don't be shaken. Don't lose your composure. Because he starts it off very like, hey, now we request you, brother, with regard to the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together with him. Clearly, that's a rapture event. Us being gathered with him. That goes back to the very previous letter that he wrote them, which is in chapter 4, verses 13 through 18. He's talking about the rapture of the church. Again, pre-tribulation rapture is the only thing that makes all this make sense. And he goes on to say that, he said, don't be disturbed about this. And then he says, let no one in any way, verse 3, deceive you, for it will not come, us going to be with the Lord, unless the apostasy comes first, which that's what I think we're seeing right now. I think we're in the very act of seeing the great apostasy take place around the world. Is it the great apostasy? I don't know, but it's clearly, if it's not, it's darn close. You're seeing Christians leaving, supposedly Christians leaving all the time, churches breaking apart, embracing all this crazy ideologies that are completely unchristian, even deny Jesus Christ himself. And then he goes on to say that, so you're going to have this apostasy that takes place first. And then he says, the man of lawlessness, the Antichrist figure that we're talking about, is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. So, get a drink of water. Sorry. So, you have him going in and saying he's declaring himself to be God, to be worshipped. He's declaring himself to be the Messiah, the God-man. We know that the only true God-man is Jesus Christ, fully God, fully man, hypostatic union. He's claiming to be God, but we know in fact he's actually indwelt or possessed by Satan, which goes back to what it talks about in Revelation 13, where it says that he's empowered by by Satan, the first beast, right? So he's empowered by Satan, and that's how he's doing these lying wonders and deceptions to deceive the world. But part of that will be this rebuilt temple that he goes into and declares himself to be God, which, well, that presupposes there has to be a temple. So as we just read in the various verses, there's a temple clearly being talked about that all specifically has to do with the coming of Antichrist and the end times. That takes us to Revelation 11. Revelation 11, verses 1 and 2. You can read through it all if you want. It gives you some great information about things we should expect to see, including worldwide visual communications, other things that would be at time. So you're talking about this narrow window of time when you should expect to see these events. Just and so happen, we have all that. Worldwide visual communications and so forth. None of it fit Israel back in its land. If those things weren't there, none of this fits. But they're all there. If we didn't have nations lined up against Israel, if we didn't have people all around the planet hating Israel, just like the Bible alludes to and talks about, and just so happens that's what's happening right now. Anyway, he says in verse 1 and 2, he says, then there was given to me a measuring rod like a staff, and someone said, get up and measure the temple of God, an altar. Clearly he's talking about the temple of God and those who worship it. And he's not talking about one in heaven, and you'll know why here. In verse 2, he says, leave out the outer court, which is outside the temple, do not measure it, for it has been given to the nations, and they will tread it underfoot of the whole city for 42 months, or 3.5 years. Well, that's clearly the last 3.5 year period of time, because the Antichrist goes in to declare himself to be God, and then somehow this outer temple court is going to be given over to the nations somehow, and it's going to be treaded underfoot in that sense, and he's going to be declaring himself to be God, and he's got this abomination of desolation he's set up on the wing of the temple that is going to be interactive somehow, in which all people are going to be taking this mark of the beast, which is going to be a global economic system that has to do with worship of this Antichrist figure. That's what we see. So when people are talking about, well, what's the big deal about the temple? What's the big deal about these red heifers? What's the big deal about this Levitical priesthood? And they're studying and practicing sacrifices and doing these altar sacrifice reenactments and stuff like that. And it's like it's all a precursor to the establishment of this temple. And now we hear people in the administration and both Israel and America, high-ranking people talking and alluding to rebuilding a temple. I find that significant. I find that important. And as a Christian, you should too. And when they start talking about these peace accords between Israel and the nations, i.e. this peace accord that they're talking about right now, the Abraham peace accords, that's significant. That's important. Who's involved in it is the next obvious question, because whoever's ultimately confirms it is the Antichrist, especially if it's a 7-year one. And, hey, people, they're pretty adamant about things. And that's why Jesus said, don't be deceived. That was one of the first things he had. He says, what should we know about the end times, when he was talking to them? And he says, don't let yourself be deceived. So we have to remember that just because we like someone doesn't mean that this person couldn't be, the Antichrist. So I'm not saying Trump is the Antichrist. I'm not saying Jared Kushner is the Antichrist, but I'm certainly saying those two are potentially the Antichrist. And we as Christians, just because you may like one of these guys, or you may like both of these guys, or whatever, doesn't mean that they're not the Antichrist. We need to remember that. Our allegiance is to our King, and it's not him. It's our King is Jesus Christ. He's our Messiah. He's our Lord. He's the one who's coming to establish his eternal kingdom. And our allegiance is to him. It's not to America. It's not to Trump. It's not to Jared Kushner. It's not to anybody. It's to Christ alone. It's not even to your local church. Although you obviously want to be loyal to the fellowship you're in. But our loyalty is to Jesus Christ. I mean, that's ultimately what it comes down to. And we want America to do well. We want all nations to do well. We want, our president to do well. We want all presidents to do well. We want them all to be kind and considerate and loving. We want our fellow workers that we work with every day to be good, loving, and kind, and generous. And we want to be the same to them. Unfortunately, there's bad people out there who do bad things, and sometimes you have to distance yourself from them. We all have those kind of people. It's just, hey, it doesn't mean that you don't want to be kind or considerate or loving. It's just sometimes you have to distance yourself from people who aren't loving and kind, and they're spiteful, and they use you, and they do all kinds of bad things. So you have to distance yourself from them. In the same way, just because you love these people in the country and so forth, doesn't mean that you have to give yourself over to it and be deceived by it either. You have to remember, use some wisdom about this stuff, and it talks about there are people of dissension that you're to, warn them once, warn them twice, and then, have nothing to do with them. Treat anyone as a tax collector. Well, that falls for nation states too. Just because somebody, is where you were born doesn't mean you have to have this kind of diehard loyalty to it to the point where you're deceived and you buy into it hook, line, and sinker, and you're a useful idiot. You have to be wise and discerning as Christians. And one of those things is we need to be paying attention. I'm not saying that these are the peace accords that is the 7-year peace accords of the Antichrist, but clearly it's the closest we've ever seen. Clearly it's Israel and the nations. Clearly there's a call to rebuild a temple. Clearly there's things that are happening that seem to line up. And Israel's back in its land. The national alignments are there. There's a lot of instability economically around the world where you could see, and people are saying there's so much massive debt in the world through all these nations that we need a new economic restart. You hear people talking about that. You hear all these problems that are happening right now. You hear the craziness that's coming out of the UN with the global tax credits and carbon tax and all this stuff and net zero and all this kind of crazy stuff, so that people can starve to death. Kind of fits what we talk about in the book of Revelation when you see that, it takes a man's bag full of gold to basically buy enough bread to eat for a day. I mean, you can see where you're going to have this global famine because of these crazy people and events that are happening, hyperinflation and stuff. All these things are lining up very, very much so, I think. And we as Christians shouldn't be deceived when these things are happening. So if we see someone who is involved in a peace accord, and if it comes out that it's a 7-year peace accord, we need to be able to say with a clear voice, this is the Antichrist. And people can say, hey, wait a minute, you were just following this guy. You were just voting for this guy or whatever, supporting these people. You're going to look really stupid. And it's going to be very hard to overcome that hurdle, which I think is going to happen. But irregardless, you're going to have to do it. And we're going to have to point out and say, hey, this is the guy. Now, I'm not saying that Trump is the Antichrist, but I'm saying that if he is, we need to be able to call him out on it. And if Jared Kushner is, we need to call him out. And anyone else is, we need to call him out on it. But clearly, we need to be looking and ready and have our eyes wide open to say, hey, there's radical stuff happening right now. And when you hear them talking about rebuilding the temple, and when you hear them talking about peace agreements, especially if it's a 7-year peace agreement, and when you hear these things being mentioned and talked about, we need to wake up, guys. And we need to be firmly convicted about what we believe and why we believe it and who we're serving and who is our master and who's not. Jesus is our master. He's our king. Not politicians around the planet. Not your nation states. It doesn't mean you can't have some patriotism about where you live, but as Christians, we love all people. I love people in Russia. I love Christian brothers in Russia, China, and El Salvador as much as I love Christians in America. And we need to understand that. That our citizenship is in heaven. It's not necessarily here on earth. Yeah, we have a citizenship here, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate what America does and the freedoms I'm allowed right now. But we have to realize that, when Antichrist comes on the scene, he's going to take away those freedoms in all countries, including this country. And all the nations are going to be called down to the valley of judgment for the tribulation period of time. All means all. That means America is going to be at that forefront. And honestly, I think that America will be part of the beast, if not heading up the beast empire. So we need to be aware of that. Anyway, I hope this is a blessing to you. I hope this opens up if you haven't looked at it, why the temple and the rebuilding of the temple is so important. If you get a chance, do a little search, do a little bit of lookup on rebuilding of the temple and the Temple Mount itself and how much it's being talked about by people in power. These aren't fringe people. And that you have groups that are really working diligently and putting their money where their mouth is. I'm talking not little dollars, I'm talking big dollars of reconstituting the artifacts. You're talking about artisans. You're talking about people who are, dedicated their life to Levitical service, which is entailed a lot. And if you don't know what that is, look into it. It means it's a full-time commitment, and these guys are doing that. So be aware that this isn't, pie in the sky stuff. This is really happening, and it's really happening now. I mean, you have guys who have committed their life to Levitical priesthood service, and that entails a huge sacrifice of their life and where they can go, where they can't go, what they can eat, what they can't eat. I mean, it's a huge sacrifice, and people aren't maybe thinking about that. And then the overall thing about, that constitutes all the stuff. It's a big deal. So anyway, be looking, be ready. I think it's near. And with that revealing, I think the rapture could be shortly thereafter. God bless you. Keep looking up, and I'll see you later.